in the New Deal, right? So this is a time when a quarter of the population is out of work. The people are waiting in lines for thin soup and moldy bread and other low quality food because they have nothing else to eat. The federal government of the United States ordered the destruction of food.
All right, so Robert Wright, it's so nice to have you back here again. It's been a while since we've done one of these, and I'm really excited because you are in the process of writing this book on the New Deal, of which it is the 90th anniversary this year. And so what you've been finding in your research is that there are many parallels that can be drawn between what happened under the New Deal regime and what's happening now. And, you know, the old adage, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme, seems to be true here. And so what I'd like to do with you is kind of go through what you've identified as 10 steps in something that you call two great resets, ? So the first great reset being between 1929 and 1945, and the second great reset being between 2020 and 2030. So I think it's going to be really exciting to talk about it. So let's start with maybe what happened with the New Deal, just like a broader picture of the New Deal. What was that like, and how did it change the infrastructure of America and of the world?
So the New Deal was a period of very rapid change in the relationship between the federal government and individuals in America. Before the New Deal, most government, when people thought of government, they thought of their local government or maybe by that stage the state government. But during the New Deal, the federal government really comes to the fore and begins to directly act on individual Americans in a number of profound ways. So we go basically from a classical liberal sort of society where if there was a problem, people would say, well, what can I do to get with my neighbors in order to ameliorate this issue? After the New Deal, Americans start to say, what can Washington do to solve this problem?
Yes.
It was, some people at the time, like Garrett Garrett, a journalist who was critical of the New Deal, basically said that it was a revolution. It was bloodless, but it was a sort of coup. It's where the federal government took over the reins of government from state and local governments and essentially began implementing policies that would make the founders lament the passing of the republic, basically. Sort of the lowest point of this, or the highest point, if you're a fan of the federal government, was a 1942 Supreme Court decision called Wickard, where the Supreme Court said that the federal government had the power to prevent a farmer from growing crops that were going to be used for his personal consumption only.
Yeah, that there's huge implications to that, right? Like, and we often think in terms of how things are today kind of being normal, but what you're saying is that back then people had a lot more liberty. Like, you didn't need the government's permission to have cows or have chickens to provide food for your own family, right?
Right. And in fact, one way that people talk about the sea change is that before the New Deal, there was a presumption of liberty. Americans could do what they wanted, and the government had to prove that there was a public interested reason for preventing you from engaging in that activity. After the New Deal, it became the burden of citizens to prove that they had a right to do something. Like in the case of Wickard, to grow whatever crops and whatever amounts they wanted. So it was very clearly a very major change. FDR becomes president in 1933, but actually some of these changes began under the Hoover administration. So that's why I date it. And also traditional New Deal historians end at about 1938 when the second New Deal, as it's called, sort of ran out of steam. But I put World War II in there because it's the same president and he's following the same agenda, as we'll see. And that agenda
Right.
is more and more power for him and for the federal government and less liberty for individual Americans.
And was this happening, Robert, because this was kind of a trend of the times? Like this was what was going on in Europe as well. It was no longer popular to have individual liberty. It was becoming more that the individual should sacrifice themselves in some ways to whatever the state apparatus wanted to do.
That's right, and I devote an entire chapter in the book to talking about the progressive movement, which was a little bit earlier in the 20th century and reached its peak during the Great War, World War One, when Woodrow Wilson was president, and that's when we get the national income tax, and the Federal Reserve is formed, and of course, during the Great War, there were all kinds of wartime restrictions put in place. And the progressives really picked up on that. A lot of progressives, at the leadership level, the policy level, were trained in European universities because we didn't have PhD granting universities yet, right? So Americans went to Europe
Interesting.
and were educated and then came back and formed their own PhD programs, and eventually we would be number one, but for a long time, the place to go was Germany. That's where most
Ah,
historians and economists were trained from that progressive era, and they learned, Bismarckian strong central state sort of theories and ways of thinking, and brought it back to the United States. Harvard, Yale, the University of Wisconsin were big centers for this progressive intellectual
oh,
milieu.
that's really interesting. I was reading The Road to Serfdom, and Frederick von Hayek, he talks about that, how actually the German academics were talking about kind of redefining liberty around that time, and they were really espousing kind of ideas of socialism, which later turned into fascism. And so that was kind of a trend. And I didn't actually know how those ideas were transported to America. So it was really through the university, how people started to think about things. And then that kind of spread into policy. We kind of look at the system that's around us, and you're explaining that in your book, I guess the architecture for how things are now was kind of laid out during that period around, the 1930s and 1940s. So can we maybe go into some of your specifics about that? You have 10 points that you've brought up here. And so you show how in each of the 10 points, there's a parallel between what happened then and what happened now. And the first point being state control of mass media. So newspapers, movies, radio, theater, to vilify critics of administration policies as anti-democratic extremists. So you're saying that this happened then and this happened now. So what are some
Right.
examples of that then, and what are some examples in the modern day?
Well, the modern days of the Twitter files, right, where the government is censoring speech on social media platforms. We know Twitter for sure because of the ownership change there, but we also suspect on Facebook and all the other major platforms. Today, you're vilified as this anti-democratic extremist if you're pro-Putin, or not sufficiently pro-Ukraine, right? And then you're pro-Putin, and you're a bad guy, or you're labeled a white supremacist, which harkens back to the Second World War when you would be labeled pro Hitler, pro Nazi, unless you towed the administration line and basically parroted what the administration said, or you were labeled an economic royalist, which was sort of the white supremacist term. FDR had to be careful about using white supremacist term too much because a lot of his support came from Southern Democrats, who of course were bona fide white supremacists. He put a member of the Ku Klux Klan on the Supreme Court, a fellow by the name of Hugo Black from Alabama. Was FDR's first pick for the Supreme Court as soon as an opening came up. So back then, newspapers were huge. There were, in big cities like New York, had like 4 or 5 functioning dailies. It was just, very much a sort of newspaper print culture. So there were folks who FDR went after because they opposed his administration, like Robert McCormick at the Chicago Tribune, which was very much against the administration. So when World War II hits and there's paper rationing, guess whose paper ration gets cut? Chicago Tribune, right? Garrett Garrett, who I mentioned earlier, who was staunchly anti-New Deal. When the war comes around, he's immediately relieved of his post at the Saturday Evening Post, which was a major, of course, print source back then. Movies as well. The administration is using public funds to create basically propaganda in favor of the administration. They use those same funds for theater, to create plays that vilified the administration's opponents and upheld New Dealers like Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes and Henry Morgenthau and of course the president himself. Radio was interesting in many ways. Radio was also huge back then. This is pre-television. Everyone listened to their radios. So they decreased the time that it took to apply for licenses for the spectrum. Your radio station number, basically. That's the way things used to work with AM and FM. You had to get a license to have a certain slice of that spectrum so that you could use it and only you could use it. Well, they reduced that licensing time down to like 6 months. So if any radio station put any anti-New Deal stuff on, their license could not be renewed when the 6 months were up. And there's instances where this was applied. There was FDR decided that rather than using private contractors to run the U.S. airmail system, that he was going to use U.S. Army pilots. So this was a way of a budget constraint. Right? And so wasting all this money on these private contractors, he's going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and give Army pilots training while simultaneously, delivering the mails. And he was told that this was a very bad idea, that Army Air Force pilots were not up to the task, and it's a very different sort of flying, and so on and so forth. And FDR said, no, we're going to do this. There were like 6 crashes with deaths and destruction of mail in the first week of this policy implementation. So a World War I ace says, I'm going on the radio and exposing this. And FDR shut him down by making a phone call to the radio station and threatening their license if they let this fellow speak out.
Outrageous. And so these critics of the New Deal, they were treated in the same way as now. So like FDR was progressive. And so if you were an entrepreneur or a free marketeer or something like that, or part of the old right, you would be considered a critic. And then they would do the same kind of tactics as now, where they would say you were pro-Hitler because Hitler was considered right-wing. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
That's part of it. They anyone they didn't like, basically, they would throw these labels on. They didn't like throwing around the fascist word too much because many New Dealers were actually on record as being pro-Mussolini. So it was a little, a little tricky there, and that's why,
Tricky.
if you were pro-Hitler, you were Nick. If you were pro-Mussolini, that's fine. I guess because Mussolini just invaded African countries and not, not European ones or what have you. But you were an economic royalist if you believed in, crazy things like property rights. You're just an economic royalist. It was supposed to make you, seem like a bad person because you're a royalist, right? You believe in royalty.
And would that be people who were opposed to having their gold confiscated? Because I know that FDR did that, right?
Yeah, FDR did that. Yep. So yeah, it would include those sorts of folks. So today we also see a big augmentation of state surveillance and law enforcement, right? With the National Security Administration, the CIA, the Patriot Act, which they've juiced up, the J5, committee. Well, back in the start of the Second World War, in the New Deal, there was a big increase in the FBI. This was J. Edgar Hoover, who was not necessarily a big fan of Roosevelt. He was a big fan of J. Edgar Hoover, though. And so he wanted to please the boss and did so by, harassing and tracking anyone who might be a threat to the administration, including the black press. If you were African American journalist, almost certainly Hoover had a file on you. And as he did many other people, our national security apparatus wasn't all that strong yet by the time World War II gets around. So Roosevelt allows the British to conduct security operations within the United States against people who might be in support of Hitler, which was anyone who was against U.S. involvement in the war. Right.
Right. So
Same sort of thing we get now where, you're not 100% behind the administration, you're an enemy, and you need to be tracked and harassed and so on and so forth. In both of these resets, I see a division of people by class and race and religion. So today, the class stuff we saw with the masks and tax the rich, sort of mantras, and BLM, of course, on race, and in religion now we seem to be at the point where it's like atheist versus believer.
yes.
Right. So it doesn't matter if you're a Protestant or a Catholic or even a Muslim. You're all believers, right? And there's something wrong with you. You should be should be an atheist, right? Not believe in God at all, and have or just have a very sort of bland general spirituality. I guess it's okay to worship Gaia.
Yeah, I think that might be because if you're a believer, that means that you're anti-science in a way, and science has kind of become part of the state dogma, like the science, right?
Yes, right, yeah, and churches are an alternative source of authority. You might not follow the government if your church says, well, what the government's doing is wrong, right? Or if you
Yes.
have a moral compass, especially in an inner-directed one. But it seems most of us at this point have other directed personalities where we feel good about ourselves if other people do, instead of feeling good about ourselves because because we're living according to some sort of internal compass that we may have gotten from our parents and or religious leaders.
Yeah, same thing happened back then. I was going to ask. So with religion as well, that was kind of under attack if you were a believer. Was that it, or was it more for other reasons?
Well, it was attacks on specific religions, especially Catholicism, because it was thought that you would take orders from the Pope instead of from the president. But it was more back then to destroy charity, private charity, because
Private
that's
charity.
the alternative to having FDR, Uncle Sam pay people who are unemployed down on their luck, right? Well, where
A-
were the churches? Well, they were there, but they were also suppressed.
And can we highlight that for a little bit for people, like what that actually looked like back then before the New Deal? Was private charity a big part of how society kind of ran well enough?
Well, it was huge. I have a book that is still forthcoming, but I'm told any day now. Liberty Lost will come out. I think we've talked about that in the past, but it's where I describe the size and effectiveness of private charity and other nonprofit groups in the United States before the Civil War. Absolutely enormous. Over the rest of the 19th century, you start to see more and more local governments and state governments getting involved, like with the Hull House movement in Chicago and all of that. The progressives start bringing the state in, but at first at that local and state level. But of course, during the New Deal, it's the federal government's job suddenly to supply relief.
So is that
So
where the welfare state began, in a sense, during the New Deal? Or was that
uh,
already
the federal
creeping in?
welfare state, the federal welfare state, absolutely started during the New Deal. In terms of race, Jim Crow continues. FDR does not want to do anything against race. He wouldn't even sign an anti-lynching bill because he doesn't want to lose support of Southern conservatives who might bounce to the Republican Party and eventually, 30, 40 years later do move to the Republican Party. This plays right into the Japanese internment story as well, where the Japanese Americans in Hawaii and the West Coast were put in internment camps during the Second World War by the U.S. federal government, by FDR. It was very easy for them to do that in terms of their ideology. They're essentially racist. They pretended to do things for people of color, but as I show in the book and as others have shown, they absolutely did not. They hurt them at every turn, and they divided
Yeah.
people by class with this economic royalist argument, with catch slogans like "Soak the rich," where don't worry about the income tax. We're going to tax the rich, right? But over the course of the New Deal, the common person's getting taxed more and more and more. But it's the rich, we got to go after that. If they would just pay their fair share, that we wouldn't have to raise the taxes on the working man so
Right.
much.
I remember FDR giving I think it was a radio talk about giving your fair share, right? So that's what happened then, is that they say we're going to tax the rich, and a lot of people say, yeah, let's tax the rich. That's going to make us better off, and we deserve a bigger part of that pie. They think it's the finite pie. And then when it trickles down to them, because there's not enough money through taxing the rich, or maybe even that it's not just that there's not enough money, but it's that a lot of the rich, that people tend to be thinking are going to be taxed, are actually kind of cozied up with the government, and there's a lot of cronyism happening, isn't there? So they just go to kind of take the money out of the kind of ordinary people. Is that how it went?
Two things explain the obscene American tax code. And one is that it's rich people who are connected with the government getting tax breaks. And the other is this progressive mindset that they can tweak economic outcomes through the tax code, which was one of the reasons why they pushed so hard for the income tax. And it turns out that poor people can't avoid the taxes, can't take advantage of the deductions, but rich people can. So it's just one of the many ways that the New Deal hurt vulnerable people, as the left likes to say, while not really implementing fundamental change. And part of the way that they're able to do this is through fear. And what a lot of people fear most of all is not having enough food. Right?
Right. And that brings you to your fourth point. So before you go there, I just want to do a little recap. So you have out of these two great resets, what we see, these parallels are state control of mass media, augmentation of state surveillance and law enforcement, division of people by class, and then the fourth step, which is disruption of food creation and distribution systems. So we see that happening there, and you see that happening now.
Right. Today it's via ESG. Environment, social, and governance. We saw it big time in Sri Lanka. There are protests in Holland because it's going, and it's coming to the United States as well. In the New Deal, right? So this is a time when a quarter of the population is out of work. The people are waiting in lines for thin soup and moldy bread and other low quality food because they have nothing else to eat. The federal government of the United States ordered the destruction of food. Animals slaughtered and essentially wasted, and crops already in the ground, plowed up and destroyed like they were weeds.
How did they do this?
They ordered it. They gave incentives to farmers to do it. Why they did it is because presumably they wanted higher prices for food so that farmers would be able to repay their debts.
They wanted to stimulate the economy too. Is that part of it?
No. It was about farmers being able to repay their debts. And so you can hardly blame the farmers, though many of them were traumatized by having to do this, because the government was giving them more money than they were anticipating getting by raising the crops to maturity or the livestock to maturity and selling them in the market, given prices were what they were at the time. I can't blame the farm, but it was a stupid policy idea that was really sort of confusing what the main issue was, which was that the money supply had plummeted. So prices went down. So they should have found a way to reflate to get the money supply back up to where it should have been, and then prices would have been restored without destroying anyone's dinner or sustenance. But they didn't do that, partly because they wanted, and this is parallel number 5, they wanted to introduce a new monetary system. So back then we went from being on a retail gold standard to a fiat system. So you used to be able to take physical paper currency or your deposits and exchange them for gold or silver at a at a fixed rate. The New Deal not only broke that link to make sure that it was broken, it confiscated all the monetary gold in the country. It wasn't quite like the Grinch, stealing every single little present in Whoville, because they made some exceptions for jewelry and for numismatic coins of collector's value. But those were really minor exceptions, and there was no way that the stock of gold left with the public could have supported a continuation of like an illicit underground retail gold standard. So they effectively killed that. But they said, well, we're still on the gold standard, though, a gold exchange standard, because we're still going to allow gold to flow in and out of the United States, but just in and out of the Federal Reserve, not out of individual accounts.
And why was that beneficial for the purposes of the New Deal? Like, what was the logic behind that?
Well, it gave them more monetary policy discretion. So the whole idea behind because now they're controlling when and how much gold can flow in and out of the Federal Reserve. Under the old system, individuals are making that decision. Yeah, I'm going to
via the market.
Via the market, yeah. This way, your monetary policy, as the economists say, is exogenously determined. It's determined by market forces. By turning to fiat, it gives the power to the federal government. Now, with this little wrinkle in the U.S. case that the Federal Reserve is like partly owned by commercial banks, and back then it was more decentralized and had less power. But a little bit later on, in 1935, the federal government increases the power of the Federal Reserve. And of course, infamously, basically, Treasury basically made the Fed its lapdog until the Fed Accords, in the 1950s. So the Treasury, i.e., the Treasury Secretary, i.e., an appointee of the president, is the one who is determining monetary policy.
Right. And that was different, right? I mean, that was very different than what was happening before. I think that's important to emphasize, is that the market was in control of, how the economy moved. And now here it was like, now we're really going to implement monetary policy, right? Like, I believe that I read that now the Federal Reserve had the power to manage the economy. Is that true? Like, that was put into law?
Well, to try to manage the economy, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
They call it monetary policy discretion, not absolute control. But in the second Great Reset, we see talk of creating a central bank digital currency, which would essentially completely turn over control of the economy to the Fed, because it could make and destroy money at will, and also the distribution of money at will. And it would also give the federal government lock, stock, and barrel, assuming that there's no outside illicit currency arises. It would give the Fed complete control over taxation as well, because there'd be no way to hide any transaction.
Anything.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's it's the next logical step from a fiat system. And of course, I've already argued that I think that while it wouldn't be unconstitutional for the Fed to offer a central bank digital currency as a payment system, because it already has a payment system, it could offer an alternative payment system to make it the sole legal way of making payments, I think would be unconstitutional.
And a payment system, sorry, but what do you mean by that, Robert? Like a payment system for who?
Between banks.
Okay, I see. So not for private citizens, but for banks.
Right.
Okay.
And it would really be pushing it if they said, well, all private citizens could only use this. That's when I think it crosses the line into being unconstitutional, because all the forms of money discussed in the Constitution are all bearer instruments. So that means there's a degree of anonymity built right into the instrument, right? Like a full-bodied gold coin was a bearer instrument. All I needed to do would be to give it to you to satisfy the debt. Then you're the bearer of it, and I no longer am. Same thing with
Yes.
Federal Reserve notes, right? If I owe you $1,000, I can count out 10 100s and give it to you, and then that payment has been made. But with a retail CBDC, the government would see that I was giving you $1,000, and then would be able to, inquire, why did you make this payment?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's scary to think about what that kind of regime would look like, right?
Very scary. Yes. Yep. So again, a parallel between the 1930s with the move away from gold to fiat, and then possibly a CBDC here. But of course, the state has, and this is point six, has other ways of coercing people to achieve state goals. So we saw that during the pandemic with lockdowns, right? Mask mandates, vaccine mandates, take this shot or you're going to lose your job sort of thing. With the lockdowns, it was fines if you tried to keep your church or business open. And these all were supported by changes in constitutional thought as well. And there's been some talk about packing the Supreme Court, as it's called. In other words, adding a bunch of justices to it so that the administration that is running the Great Reset gets constitutional or legal cover for what they're doing.
Right.
Right now, the Biden administration is not getting much support from the Supreme Court, so it has been talking about ways of adding justices so that Biden can appoint them. And FDR threatened the same thing. After some of his New Deal programs were struck down, especially the Blue Eagle, as it's sometimes called, but the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was an attempt to cartelize and socialize U.S. industry, the manufacturing sector, and the retail sector. So the idea was that if your business didn't follow certain codes, like with a minimum wage and price, what you would sell your wares for, you would get a Blue Eagle if you follow those codes, an emblem that you could stick on your advertising and you could put in your window. And then all the good citizens would, of course, go to your bakery, say, instead of the bakery down the road that didn't display the Blue Eagle because it wasn't allowed to, because it didn't follow the codes, right?
It was a symbol of compliance.
Yeah, symbol of compliance, absolutely. And the government really cracked down on people who used the blue emblem when they weren't supposed to, or who took the blue emblem, had signed the pledge for the code, but then started to break it. So there was an instance, for example, where they threw a guy in jail because he was selling bread for 9 cents instead of the 10 cents that it said in the code. Right? Now, this is during the Depression again, right? So you would think that lower prices for bread would be good because more people could afford to buy a loaf of bread. No, not if you want to augment the power of the government, right? You want that person who can't pay the 10 cents for the loaf of bread to go to the bread line and get their handout from the government. And also you want to keep those prices up so that creditors can be repaid. Well,
So you just said something there, Robert, augment the power of the government. Okay.
Right.
So this is something that, maybe it's more difficult to think about, like, how exactly does that happen? These kinds of systems, right? Like the NRA, or even like what happened throughout COVID with the emergency powers and things like that. How does that augment the power? Like, why? What's the process look like?
The process is to create economic incentives so that people want to follow the government's dictates, and then punishing them if they don't. These dictates often are nonsensical, right?
Right.
Like punishing people because they're offering lower prices during a depression, right?
So then for me, that's kind of what I wanted to get to then. So the point of all of that was kind of power for the sake of power itself. It wasn't even necessarily to expand the government by having more revenue. It was really like for the sake of being able to have power over individuals' choices. Like that was kind of how that mechanism played out.
Right. And so ostensibly, this was going to help the economy. It was going to reduce unemployment, and it would help FDR get reelected in 1936. And it would set a precedent, because then the government could say, hey, it worked, so why don't we expand it? And then they'd get even more power.
So it was for the greater good. It was like, whatever the ends are, like all of the means justify those ends. And the ends
Yeah.
are a better society, economic recovery. And, what that actually means behind all of that is that we get more power to rule
Right.
over you and make the right choices for you.
Now, it didn't work. The economy began to improve markedly after it hit bottom in March of 1933 when FDR came on. And partly that was because the money supply came back and inflation expectations were higher. So the economy kind of really boomed from March until like August or September of 1933. But then the NRA code started to kick in, especially with the high wage policy and all of the time and effort that was going into making these codes, which were very detailed in some cases, just remarkable attempt at central planning. So the economy turned downward, and so it didn't help in the end. And a lot of people were happy when the Supreme Court put the bullet in its head, because that gave them, an excuse to end this awful thing. It would be like if the Supreme Court recently, like if it had, like right after the Great Barrington Declaration, said, hey, these lockdowns are unconstitutional, right? Then we could just end it
Yeah.
all without going through that long, drawn out process of, letting things just kind of end slowly over years.
Yes. Yes, I
Yeah.
see. So let's move
But,
maybe
but
to a,
FDR did not like it, and he didn't
sorry.
like what other FDR didn't like it, so he tried to pack the court. He tried to put a bunch more justices on, and that didn't work politically. It was just too far. What dissent there was, it pointed out to people that he was acting like a tyrant, that we were becoming a dictatorship, and especially would if he could appoint a majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, essentially, right? That would really collapse the separation of powers in the U.S. yet further. So it was put down, but the Supreme Court was kind of chastened by the whole thing, and their behaviors did. Two justices in particular did change after the court pack attempt, and then just nature took over, and these old conservative judges started retiring and dying, and were replaced by like Klan members, like the who I mentioned earlier, Hugo, Hugo Black.
Wow, that's incredible. So let's
Yeah.
look at, we have a couple of more points here. So to talk about, these two great resets. So we have the maintenance of invisible enemies is next. So what did that look like then and now?
Well, now it's COVID, right? Is this kind of invisible enemy? and climate change, global climate change, right? Back then, it was unemployment was the great unsafe. Now, it's not that it didn't exist; it's that the causes of it were quite clear to many people, and it could have been solved. But as Garrett Garrett once said, the New Deal fed off from misery. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that FDR deliberately kept unemployment high, but it did allow him to keep the crisis environment going, which, gave him cover for things like presenting huge bills to Congress that people in Congress didn't even read. They just passed because it's an emergency. That should sound pretty familiar.
Yeah, it sounds familiar, right? It sounds familiar. So, it doesn't sound so far off that that might be the case, right? That was kind of, at the very least, an advantage.
Right. So again, all he had to do was reflate, or even allow real wages to fall. But both Hoover and FDR put policies in place to keep real wages high. So if something's costly, right, if it's pricey, people demand less of it. Mm-hmm. And that's why there's unemployment. What would have happened if wages were allowed to follow the market would be that real wages would have fallen until it was worth it for businesses to rehire people.
Right, right.
Boatloads of econometric evidence on that. It's possible because, FDR, like the current administration, doesn't seem to be real solid on economic concepts, partly because, they're unconstrained thinkers, and Thomas Sowell's, dichotomy between constrained thinkers who sort of follow reality and the actual science, and then unconstrained thinkers who think that they can just mandate their will and it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Even with complex phenomenon. So number 8, we're moving towards physical war now, kinetic war, as they say it, as they call it these days. And the government might want to do this to get what Bob Higgs called the Ratchet effect. Wars in U.S. history have been a time period where the federal government has gotten much, much bigger and more powerful. And then after the war, its powers and revenue are decreased, but it never goes back to the same starting level. It's always at a higher level than before the war. So wars help the U.S. federal government, and that explains the Ukraine aid, the sanctions against Russia, right? Like we're trying to start a fight deliberately with Russia. The trade restrictions against the Chinese look very much like the aid that we were giving to Britain in the Second World War and the sanctions that we put against Japan. Japan was the big enemy, right, in the Far East in the 1930s, and we kept ratcheting up the sanctions against them to the point that some people claim that Japan basically had to fight us because we were doing everything possible to stop the flow of essential raw materials to Japan before the war. And so, by their military doctrine, it was go big or go home, and that's why they attacked Pearl Harbor. So the Chinese have a similar sort of response, where the U.S. is not somebody you want to get into a protracted conflict with. You need to take them out right at who knows what that would look like.
Right.
But in any event, it would create a crisis where the federal government could augment its powers and do things like increase taxes, both the rate and the collection effort, which is number 9 on my list. So we know that there are calls, like to let the Trump era tax rates to expire and the doubling of the standard deduction. We know that there are increased collection efforts with the hiring of 87,000 new
Yes.
IRS agents. And there's talk about new taxes. So they're talking about this unrealized capital gains tax on billionaires. Would never affect the common man, right? But on billionaires. That, like Phil Magnus has argued as correctly, is unconstitutional, clearly. But, maybe they'll try to implement it anyway. Or maybe they'll try to get a constitutional amendment just like they did for the income tax. Well, back in the 1930s, tax increases started with Hoover, right? During a depression, they're increasing tax rates and they're increasing tax collection efforts. And FDR, picked up the ball right where Hoover dropped it. They both claimed that they wanted to run a balanced budget. They were not Keynesians. Sometimes people are under that misapprehension, especially with FDR. They ran deficits sometimes just because the economy is doing so poorly that tax receipts are low. But they were increasing tax rates. And then in 1936, FDR does implement a new tax. It was an undistributed corporate profits tax. And the idea was we're going to force companies to invest in new physical plant. They're not doing it on their own. So if they don't do it, we're going to take that money from them and then we'll use it to fuel the relief programs of the New Deal.
Right. Right. And then we have finally the last one, which is misuse of congressional hearings to influence policy and public opinion. So
Right.
what does that look like?
Well, today it looks like the J6 hearings, right, which were just this sort of propaganda fiasco, sort of thing. And then back then, the most infamous hearing like that was the Pecora hearings in 1932, a Senate Banking Commission that sort of dug up every little bit of dirt on Wall Street that it could and use it to pin blame for the Great Depression on Wall Street and the stock market crash. And it was so effective that even to this day in this book, I have to go to great lengths to explain to people that the recession started before the stock market crash, months before. And
Yes.
that if Hoover hadn't have passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, if he hadn't have passed high wage policies, if the Federal Reserve had acted as a lender of last resort, or at least allowed the traditional lenders of last resort to act, if the Federal Reserve hadn't sterilized gold inflows, in other words, if it had allowed the money supply to increase again, then we wouldn't have had the Great Depression. We would have had a recession that would have ended maybe late 1930, maybe first or second quarter of 1931, but would just be another of the long litany of recessions in U.S. history. But it didn't.
I want to just back up and look at this all big picture because, I mean, I think that this is great. And it's amazing how you've been able to pull out these 10 points and to identify that we see what looks like these two great resets that have happened, which the first one changed the infrastructure of America and changed the role of the state and individual forevermore. And now it looks like that kind of authority will be even more increased, right? The state authority at an even more intense level for people. But what I find is different about this presentation of the Great Reset in America is that it's very covert, right? And Garrett pointed that out in his piece, The Revolution Was, which you referred to earlier, right? So it's not necessarily like what you see in Sri Lanka, where they apply all of the SDGs and all of the ESG and, all of these nice acronyms and then end up basically destroying their country and burning it down to the ground, essentially. It's a more kind of subtle, covert coup, as Garrett referred to, that happens via executive order and the signing of a pen and all of these kinds of things, which you mentioned, these 10 points here.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I would have to think on that some more, and I thank you for that thought provoking question. Of course, there are more than 10 parallels. Those were the 10 that happened to strike me the most when I wrote that slide. There's probably a good score of them that are just as solid, just as clear. The one kind of major difference is that this current Great Reset seems to be based more on trying to form or give more power to a supranational group. So that's one possible difference. Though mostly what we've seen is stuff that's happening at the U.S. Federal policy level rather than the supra national stuff. But just like the New Deal was influenced by the progressives, who were influenced by European university studies, we don't know where all of these policies are coming from, and some of our politicians have been, what do they call, World Economic Forum thought leaders or something in the past.
Yes, young leaders, I believe. Right.
And in Canada, right, both the Prime Minister and the Vice Prime Minister have both been.
Yes, Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau, right? That's right. So, I think that's a good point. It's kind of like how during the New Deal, you had people who were associates of Mussolini who were in the federal government, who were kind of the, how can I say, the confidants of FDR, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yes.
Like Hugh Johnson, who was head of the Civilian Conservation Corps, was a big fan of Mussolini, and of course there were communists involved in the FDR administration as well. That's why. So in the book, I don't call them communists or socialists or Nazis or fascists. I just call them collectivists, because these are all forms of collectivism with authoritarian top-down power structures and aspirations for more power.
Right. You know what, Robert? That's exactly the word that I was thinking. And that's what kind of ties in with what we were talking about in the beginning of the discussion. And Hayek, in his book, The Road to Serfdom, spoke about that when he was talking about those ideas that were spreading in German academia, right? Was that they were ideas that the collectivists basically had a vision for the world which was very different from individualism, which meant that the individual was supreme. And it just looks like we're seeing this tendency to kind of fall back into that kind of way of looking at things, right? And so that I recall reading a quote from Hannah Arendt in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she talks about how evil can spread like a fungus and touch all the corners of the earth, if it's kind of unfettered. And it looks like that is another big parallel that you can draw between what happened back then and what's going on now, where it's like these ideas become contagious. Once you have this kind of ascendant collectivism, it seems to kind of spread to other places in the world.
Yeah, and I do like to modify it. I'd have to think about ascended. I'll say authoritarian collectivism, because I personally am not opposed to voluntaristic collectivism. So like the Amish, for example, or the Hutterites. they live together and they are kibbutzim in Israel. I think that's fine. If individuals say, I want to be part of this group, and we're going to create these rules within this group to live by, and they're all there voluntarily, I have no problem with that. The problem, and there's another. Well, why can I never think of jokes properly when I'm doing these things? I think the joke goes, I have no problem with you being a communist. The problem arises when you want me to become a communist.
Yes, essentially that's what it is.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like the scalability, right? It's if you take that kind of principle of having, or communitarianism could be another word to describe what you're describing there in those small communities, right? But when you take something to scale and you apply it to nation states and then you apply it across the globe, well, that can be a really, really dangerous force. So I would like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to reading your book. I think it's coming out. It's not finished yet, so let's not announce to people when it's coming out. But are there any kind of last thoughts that you would like to share, Robert?
No, except it's always great to be with Kate, and
it's great to have you too.
Look forward to doing this again sometime.
Yes, absolutely. And if you guys want to follow Robert, you can follow him on Twitter. You can go read his work on AIER.org. And I want to thank everybody who listened today. And please give us some feedback on this discussion and let us know what you think in the comments below.